Taking the reins off an established developer is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it has potential to breathe new life into the series they're taking on, but at the same time, the dedicated fanbase would be very anxious about their next move, and thus there is no way it could live up to anyone's expectations, which stumbles me upon to Halo 4, the first instalment not developed by Bungie and when the franchise was more divisive than before. So let's take a look, shall we? We come in midway through an interrogation with Halsey being asked several questions about the morally flexible Spartan program, justifying her work by saying humanity would have been done years ago if not for them, followed by her saying not to underestimate the Chief as he is presumed dead at this point. We then jump over to what's left of the Forward Unto Dawn 4 years after the Halo event, with Cortana panicking as an unknown entity is scanning the ship, waking up the Chief as she needs him, so the Chief awakens and they fight their way out as the Covenant squad is on the ship, but they soon realise they're being pulled towards a Forerunner planet and are being trapped into its gravity well, and the pair get pulled in. After waking, the Chief asks what's up with Cortana as she's not acting normal. She says it's nothing, but he isn't convinced, and they decide finding out where they are and getting home is more important. They soon discover a phantom signal coming from the planet and later realise it's from a ship called the UNSC Infinity. After locating the cartographer, they discover it's coming from the centre of the planet as it's multi-layered, so they set off to find it and discover that it's not the centre at all, but instead approaching the planet. Knowing it will be destroyed if it reaches the gravity well, they set out to warn them to keep out of range. But on the way they discover the Prometheans, a race of advanced AI that are there to protect the planet. After thinking they'd activated a transmitter to contact the ship, they unintendedly awaken a Forerunner that calls himself the Didact, and discover the UNSC Infinity is on the planet about to crash land. After making his way towards the crash site, Chief becomes acquainted with Lasky, a commander within the UNSC and involved with the Spartan deployment. Asking Chief to assist get his men out, the Chief joins their deployment, successfully fighting off the Didact and the Covenant. The Chief then heads to the bridge, and their forces are led by this absolute twat, who apparently has no respect for Chief or Cortana. Like, seriously? Everyone else is in awe of the myth that the Chief is still alive and still admire him, but he's just like, nah, I'm better than this shit. The Chief and co are given orders to take out anti-air defences and destroy the gravity well so they can leave the planet. Whilst on mission, the Chief and Cortana get acquainted with the librarian, who has too much information to absorb in the space of a single cutscene, but I'll go into that later. She gives him some form of immunity to what is called the Composer, a super weapon that is capable of mass destruction the mind can scarcely comprehend. After making his way out and destroying the well, he returns to report what he knows to Del Rio, who is just like, yeah, whatever. So Cortana flips out and Del Rio insists she be terminated, and Chief steps in and takes her himself. Going rogue, it's up to himself and Cortana alone to defeat the Didact seemingly against the odds. After making their way on board his ship, they travel through slipspace to another Halo ring where the Composer is being kept for research. Here they discover the UNSC base is being attacked by the Covenant. Here they must find Dr. Tilsey as she has months of research invested into it. The Chief says the only way to prevent it from being used is to destroy it, so he instructs her to get a nuke and evacuate the station. But it's too late. Before they can arm it, the Didact recaptures the Composer and takes it out of the base. As the base sustained an attack, its shields are down and they cannot be reactivated before the Didact uses the Composer on the remaining humans there, and Chief's immunity seemingly works. Chief and Cortana pack a nuke and make their way to the Didact ship, following him through slipspace to planet Earth as he wants to destroy it, or compose it, if you will. After warning patrolling ships of the Didact's intentions, they attempt to distract him with a counter-attack, buying just enough time for Chief to get inside and fight his way to the Didact. After disabling its defences, it's too late as his strike has already begun, with time of the essence. He makes his way to the centre thinking he'd lost Cortana along the way. Dropping the nuke and seemingly defeated, the Chief is restrained by the Didact, but Cortana, after implanting herself into the system, strikes and pins the Didact down. The Chief then sticks him with a Promethean grenade, killing him and falling into the abyss. Scrabbling his way towards the nuke, the Chief then detonates it, seemingly sacrificing himself in doing so, but he realises he somehow survived within a force field, and Cortana reveals herself, saying the only remnants left of her saved him. After sharing one final moment, she dissipates and Chief looks longingly at the death of his closest ally. In the epilogue, we see Chief taking off his armour while a monologue of the Didact plays, stating humanity is the biggest enemy and the reclamation has begun and it can't be stopped. Well, I may as well start with the end for say. I'm glad 343 actually had the balls to kill off a main character and do it with respect. You can say what you like about the story as a whole, but the final scene with Cortana was actually really well done, as if Chief just wouldn't accept those most valued ally is gone, and let's be honest, this was most people at the end. On the topic of cutscenes, I'm again thankful that developers left in the ballsy cutscene with the scientists being disintegrated. Plenty of other developers wouldn't have left this in or changed it, as it's quite violent for a Halo game. Admittedly, it's pretty tame by other game standards like Doom or even Left 4 Dead, but it just worked within the context of the scene, demonstrating the composer's wrath. Obviously, one thing I think was done well was exploring the Chief as a human being and not just a cyborg killer. It was intriguing that they toyed with the idea that he's actually broken fundamentally as a human, which is why he's believed to succeeded where so many others failed. It's a shame this wasn't really expanded upon within the next game. Obviously the gameplay was changed substantially from the previous entries. I'm glad they made Sprint a permanent addition because it was kind of annoying in Reach to decide if you want to be able to run quicker or fly, and I'm glad they made it so you could just have both. This may also seem out of place for many players, but honestly it didn't really go underappreciated they included hit markers and a grenade indicator. Because often in other games you expended round after round not even sure if you were even hitting anything, so it was nice to have the reassurance, I guess. And as for the grenade indicator, it was nice to know when you were about to get jumped by a suicide grunt. Little buggers. One thing I noticed that I actually appreciated was seeing it as the Reach engine at full potential. Obviously they're both running the same engine, but within this one it felt like the gameplay was actually built around the new mechanics and gameplay. As I mentioned in my Reach retrospective, some things felt a bit tacked on, but in Halo 4 it seems like they actually tailored the gameplay to fit around each mechanic, especially in the multiplayer. Admittedly, not every map is great, but the maps are built with armour abilities in mind and even Sprint as well, but more on the multiplayer later. One more thing before I get into the negatives, which are many, is the soundtrack. It's a different sound to what was in the previous games, but it fits the aesthetics, and in honesty the previous games or something similar soundtrack would have just felt out of place. Obviously it's far from perfect though. The first thing you'll notice is the Promethean Knights are just ridiculous. Their attacks are overpowering and they often just teleport before you kill them, meaning they have time to recharge and have to start all over again. This isn't really a big deal and easy or normal, but on anything higher it's just tedious, especially accompanied with the dogshit ammo management. You just simply cannot carry enough ammo for anything at any time. You're constantly having to swap weapons out and reluctantly drop something that's really good because of the such limited ammo. The issue is somewhat fixed online with the addition of an option in the loadout menu, but this is obviously absent in single player. As much as I like the ending, I do feel it's a bit lacking in some places. The idea of killing the final boss with a quick time event instead of an actual gunfight was a bit tone deaf. Every other boss fight up to this point had you running around, which they should have really done here. Which leads me to the Didact himself. I feel like he was a little underwhelming as a villain. He didn't really get the build-up or development the other antagonists had. And he could have been a more compelling enemy if they took the time to do so, instead of him just being there. Needless to say that he's barely even in it. He's only really on screen for less than 10 minutes. On the topic of narrative, the Librarian cutscene contained way too much backstory and information for the space of about 5 minutes. The exposition really should have been over the course of a few missions and cutscenes, as within the previous games everything we needed to know is gradually drip-fed throughout the game, whereas here you get given a massive meal and dessert before you've even finished eating. It'll take a few playthroughs to really understand this cutscene. Final gameplay note that I disliked is the lack of Easter eggs. There's basically none outside of terminals, skulls weren't included, and aside from the odd ammo cache, it does leave a bit to be desired. Obviously it's not just a single player experience. As I mentioned earlier, the multiplayer is built around the Reach engine and I honestly enjoy it. It's weird to have loadouts in a Halo game, but it kind of worked. Most of the best maps are just remakes, but there's only so many times you can reinvent the wheel. The biggest gripe with the multiplayer is how custom games took a huge hit. You just didn't have the personalisation you got with the previous ones, especially in Infection. You couldn't change the weapons the infected had, so anything like Frogger became impossible. The game also includes a side mode called Spartan Ops, and honestly, I see it as a bit of a missed opportunity, to be honest. The idea of a story that doesn't follow the Chief or any main protagonist and being a spin-off was a pretty cool idea, but unfortunately it's just too repetitive to be interesting. There are a few missions that stand out, but once you've done one, you've basically done them all. Considering it takes a few hours to go through all of them, it just makes it such a grind. It's a shame really, because it had potential to be so much more. A few things I've noticed are gripes with other players is its lack of innovation. I'd agree to an extent, let's be honest, what could they have done to innovate on the formula anyway? Anything too far from that would have just resulted in even more backlash. But aside from design, we need to consider when it came out. It was only 2 years after Halo Reach and very near the end of the 360's relevance, so software limitations would have been a factor in creating the game. Personally, I think it should have been a launch title for the Xbox One because it would have given them more time to sand off the rough edges and fine-tune it a bit more. Another thing I've noticed is some referring to it as a remake of Halo CE, but I think it's a bit of an unjustified claim. Literally every game in the series opens with the player crashing onto a planet or object and trying to figure out what's going on, so it's really just par for the course. So how do I summarise all of this? Obviously the fans had high expectations when it came out and there was no way it could have lived up to the experiences they already had. And I think that plays a big part in the reception to this game. Obviously it was 343's first outing on the franchise, and I think just the fact that Bungie didn't make it probably played a part in people's attitudes towards it. If Bungie made it exactly the same, I'm sure everyone would have loved it. So it was in a position of doomed if they do, doomed if they don't. Overall, it's certainly not terrible. I admit it's definitely not perfect, but it's definitely not as bad as everyone seems to make it out to be. Well, I think that about covers it. Signing off.